Horror novels have never really been my cup of tea. I've tried and tried again to enjoy what I was reading, with a few notable exceptions, which is why I was skeptical of taking a class focused only on Stephen King's writing. After reading a few short stories, though, I realized why he is so beloved as an author. What makes Stephen King a notable author is not solely rooted in his stories, but in the descriptive writing that highlights the brutality of both the everyday and the fantastical. The question, "Are you afraid of a speed ironer?" sounds incredibly silly when taken out of context. What could possibly be so scary about a machine, even better, a 30-foot machine that's been sitting stationary for all of its life? It's only when said machine is taken from its source material and blown into a new perspective that fear starts to take place. In the short story The Mangler by Stephen King, the reader is introduced to a murderous speed ironer known as, you guessed it, the Mangler. An accident involving the machine occurs at Blue Ribbon Laundry, a rundown laundry company, and piques the interest of a police detective named John Hutton, who ends up getting more involved in the case than he needs to be. It's not even a page into the story that King evokes a fear in his readers. Hutton saw it. The machine was still running. No one had shut it off. The machine he later came to know intimately, the Hadley Watson Model 6 speed ironer and folder, a long and clumsy name. The people who worked there in the steam and the wet had a better name for it, the Mangler. Given the context of the rest of the story, as well as events leading up to this passage, it can be guessed as to how gruesome the whole situation really is. The brevity of the explanation feels like it gives the reader just enough context to think of what possibly could have happened. The visual I get in my brain puts a knot into my stomach. The Mangler isn't the only short story of King's that musters fear in the reader through description. In fact, there are quite a few, like Chattery Teeth or Word Processor of the Gods. I'd like to key in on one that focuses a bit more on something that would never seem to be scary. Quitters Inc. tells the story of a smoker named Richard Morrison, who's making an attempt to quit smoking after having a discussion with his old college roommate who had gone through a program at Quitters Inc. He swears that it changed his life. Morrison, intrigued, decides to give it a shot and shows up for an appointment. After a brief introduction to the mastermind behind it all, Vic Donati, Morrison goes home to enjoy his last cigarettes, returning the next day for the start of his treatment. After an ominous chat about Morrison's personal life in Donati's office, he is introduced to a rabbit in a small room. As it begins eating, Donati shocks it using a button on the wall connected to the floor of the room. Morrison is horrified. Donati explains. If the rabbit gets a jolt often enough while he's eating, Donati said, he makes the association very quickly. Eating causes pain. Therefore, he won't eat. A few more shocks and the rabbit will starve to death in front of his food. It's called aversion training. Again, even though there is no direct correlation to Morrison's treatment, the bleakness of this passage makes it very clear just what kind of rehabilitation this will be. To me, it quite literally feels like Donati is going to shock Morrison out of smoking. No, not an electrical shock, but a psychological shock. King somehow managed to take the very real horrors of rehab and twist them into a fear-mongering story that makes the readers question, what if? Even then, the sense of reality is still rooted in the story. In fact, many Goodreads reviewers stated that they resonated with the main character, in the sense that quitting smoking is really hard. This same mentality of every day is equal to eerie is utilized once again in Shawshank Redemption, which isn't exactly a horror novella, but still happens to twist everyday life into something horrifying. This time, instead of the horrors being lived through, they are being watched and awaited by the prisoners at Shawshank Prison. The story follows one specific prisoner, Andy Dufresne, in for killing his wife and her lover. Andy's story is told through the eyes of Red, another prisoner at the institution, and for also killing his wife, as well as their neighbor and her child. Over the course of their sentences, Andy and Red get awfully close. At some point in time, Andy ends up helping with the prison library. He works alongside Brooks Hatlin, an older man who's been for murdering his family. Brooks is institutionalized by prison, meaning he becomes ready, quote-unquote, for the outside world. Brooks is paroled, but not long after ends up dying. Even though Brooks' story isn't necessarily horrifying, it sure is brutal. Red says, "I heard he died in a home for indigent old folks up in Freeport Way in 1953. and that he lasted about 6 months longer than I thought he would. Yeah, I guess the state got its own back on Brooksy, alright. They trained him to like it inside the shit house and then they threw him out. Although it isn't ever explicitly stated that Brooks ends up dying by suicide, to me it is highly insinuated. Although this passage doesn't seem to necessarily spark fear in the reader, it sure does show how truly brutal the prison system is. The common theme in Shawshank is the idea that while in prison, you learn to quote-unquote love it, and when you're sent back out into the real world, you'll be craving to come back. Red talks about this after he gets paroled. I suppose they decided that at the age of 58, I was finally used up enough to be deemed safe. This quote's just sad. King's use of the words used up breaks my heart a little bit. This might be one of the best examples of how King creates the outside world to be monstrous in Shawshank. The fact that Red has plainly stated what has just been thrown into the writing of the novella here and there adds a much bigger punch. Even though Shawshank tells a different kind of horror story, one of King's most well-known books, The Stand, exhibits, in my opinion, the best example of his ability to highlight the brutality of humanity, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. In The Stand, a government-created virus is accidentally released and causes a wave of destruction and death in its wake. Left behind are those immune, or those that somehow manage to avoid it. The survivors are seemingly split between good and evil, indicated by dreams of mysterious humans. King uses this story to sprinkle in a bit of Mangler-esque horror, as well as a bit of real-life scares. An example of something a bit more like the Mangler occurs when Larry Underwood, once a singer-songwriter, now just a man living through the apocalypse, crashes his bike. He walked shakily over to the Harley and stood it up. It didn't seem to be damaged in any way, but it looked different. Before, it had just been a machine. A rather charming machine that could serve the dual purpose of transporting him and making him feel like James Dean or Jack Nicholson in Hell's Angels on wheels. But now its chrome seemed to grin at him like a sideshow barker, seeming to invite him to step up and see if he was man enough to ride the two-wheeled monster. Although there isn't an account of the machine devouring or mutilating Larry, the way that King describes the machine to be unscathed yet different is incredibly ominous. On another note, King's exploration of themes like divine judgment, the battle between good and evil, and the fragility of moral boundaries amplifies the terror in the story. He presents religion not as a source of comfort, but as something that should be feared, as it could seemingly destroy the world as we know it. Randall Flagg and Mother Abigail seem to be two contrasting religious figures. Flagg appears to be the devil's incarnate, while Mother Abigail seems to be somewhat of a messiah. Randall Flagg, the Dark Man, takes control over wild animals like weasels or wolves, as well as human beings. Flagg's only goal is to cause destruction and death. He creates a new way of living, dubbing himself the first citizen, and crucifies those who do not adhere to his rules. Stu Redman, one of the survivors, experiences dreams of what the Dark Man is doing out west. Last night, I dreamed about that black man again. It was worse yet. He's setting up where out in the desert. Las Vegas, I think, and for any, I think he's crucifying people. The ones who give him trouble. He's doing what? That's what I dreamed. Lines of crosses along Highway 15 made out of barn beams and telephone poles, people hanging off of them. What really sells this for me is how Stu describes where these people are hanging, and I can't even imagine driving down the highway lined with a bunch of dead folks. What I really admire about this novel is how King creates a new normal, much like we experienced during COVID. To the main cast of characters, life seems to go back to normal after a certain point. Mother Abigail's settlement in Boulder seems as close to normal that our cast will get. They attempt to set up a new government, they move into houses, and couples pair up. Even though life seems to be getting better, besides the feeling of impending doom Flagg holds over everyone, the idea of creating an all-new society is stressful. Nick Andros, a deaf-mute, worries about the law and order of this new society. It made him ache inside to think that they might need courts and jails, maybe even an executioner. Christ, these were Mother Abigail's people, not the Dark Man's. Nick's fears would be seen as irrational in a normal world, but considering the gravity of the situation, the idea that he has to be part of rebuilding a society must stress him out. King, again, creates a sense of how grave the situation really is. Stephen King is an extremely talented author. His stories involve the same common motifs and themes, yet all feel incredibly different from each other. King's ability to twist the normal society into something unnatural is a crazy strength that allows for a more entertaining and enlightening story.